Something moved in the vents of the USG Ishimura long before anyone had language for what it was. The first logs from that outbreak read like routine damage reports. Crew members noting malfunctions, engineers flagging anomalies, a ship the size of a city, processing the mineral wealth of a torn-open planet, running into problems it couldn't categorize, trying to document them in whatever terms it had available. Then the lights failed in a section of the engineering deck. Then something that used to be a person stood up from the floor where it had collapsed and moved toward the sound of a voice calling for help. By the time anyone thought to ask what was happening, the question had already become the wrong one. For 3 main games, a series of novels, comic expansions, and over a decade of accumulated lore, the Dead Space franchise has carried a piece of information so enormous that most players absorbed it without fully examining it. Everyone who has spent time in this universe knows about Convergence. Every fan knows the necromorphs serve the markers, and the markers serve something colossal waiting somewhere out in the dark. The word gets used so often across the trilogy that it starts to feel like scenery, something to be stopped, an extinction-level event aimed at humanity, a catastrophe with alien origins that Isaac Clarke spends 3 games desperately trying to prevent. This video is going to argue something different. Through careful reading of everything the franchise established across its games, its expanded fiction, and the design philosophy that shaped the series from its earliest days, a different picture of Convergence emerges. One that has always been present in the lore, sitting in plain sight across every game, but that the structure of the story makes genuinely easy to misread. The Convergence event was not a catastrophe that arrived from somewhere out in the dark and fell upon an unsuspecting humanity. It was a conclusion, one engineered specifically for intelligent life, set in motion long before humans existed, and designed with a precision so total that the resistance the games show us was never really possible in the way the characters believed. This video is an interpretive examination of the Convergence mythology, one that reads across all 3 games and the surrounding lore to argue that almost every character in the franchise, including the ones actively working to prevent it, fundamentally misunderstood what the process was and what it was for. The misunderstanding runs so deep that it shaped their strategies, their belief systems, and their understanding of what winning and losing even meant. By the end of this, you will understand why that misunderstanding matters more than the necromorphs ever did. You will understand why the markers were never the threat the characters identified them as. And you will understand, perhaps for the first time, why the universe in this franchise carries the name it does. Before we get into any of that, if something in this video connects for you, a detail that lands differently than it did before, a lore thread that surprises you, drop it in the comments. This channel builds its best conversations through those moments. Some of the strongest topic ideas for future videos have come directly from the people watching. So if there's a game universe you want to fall down a rabbit hole with next, throw it in. Now get comfortable, dim the lights down a little, and let's start. Chapter 1: The First Symptom. The Ishimura was not supposed to be where the story began. By the time Isaac Clarke's repair crew responded to its distress call, the planet crack operation that brought the ship Aegis 7 was already complete. The USG Ishimura was the largest planet cracker-class starship humanity had ever constructed, a mining vessel designed to extract mineral wealth from entire worlds by literally tearing sections of planetary crust free and processing them through internal refineries. Its scale was genuinely difficult to hold in the mind all at once. Its operational capacity made it one of the most valuable assets in the Concordance Extraction Corporation's fleet. Its crew was large enough that it functioned more like a floating city than a vehicle. What the operation uncovered in the rock of Aegis 7 was not ore. A red marker had been buried in the planet's surface, and the mission to Aegis 7 had been shaped, partly through the influence of the ship's Unitologist captain, by the desire to retrieve it. The captain had organized the planet crack with Unitologist channels in mind, and his communications from that period suggest a man who believed with complete sincerity that what was buried beneath was sacred, that bringing it aboard was an act of devotion. that what would follow from the marker's activation was exactly what his faith had always promised. He was correct about what would follow. In the most catastrophic sense imaginable, the marker activated. The dead began to rise. What the necromorph infection does to a body is worth slowing down to examine carefully, because the way the game presents it teaches you something specific before you understand why the lesson matters. A reanimated body in most horror traditions carries something vague, something driven by instinct, by decay, by the directionless aggression of tissue that should have stopped but hasn't. What a marker does to dead tissue operates with entirely different logic. The genetic instructions encoded in the marker's signal function like a biological program, acting on dead cells at the molecular level, restructuring musculature, extending and modifying bone structures, sometimes fusing multiple corpses together into configurations no single body could produce on its own. The resulting forms are not accidents, they are designs. A slasher is shaped the way it is because that shape is efficient at creating more bodies. Its blade arms allow it to kill quickly across a wide arc, producing the corpses that the infection then converts and adds to the available pool. An exploder carries a chemical payload in a pressurized sac because that payload, when ruptured, spreads the contagion across a radius that a slasher's melee attack couldn't reach. A lurker attaches to surfaces and attacks from covered positions because that behavior pattern keeps its body alive longer, allowing it to continue producing threats while burning through fewer of the infection's available resources. Every form is optimized for a specific function. Every function contributes to the same outcome. This is a system. Something built it. Dead Space's central gameplay mechanic, what the development team called strategic dismemberment, forces the player to internalize this logic before they have the vocabulary to name it. Shooting a necromorph in the chest does very little. Shooting it in the head does very little. To kill one, you have to understand its structure. You have to identify which components make the creature dangerous and sever those specifically. You cut off the arms that carry the blades. You take the legs to prevent the creature from closing distance. You adjust for whatever new limbs or forms emerge after the primary ones are gone, because the infection recalculates even at the individual body level, sometimes producing new threats from the same corpus after you've already addressed the initial one. The game is training you to think about bodies as systems of components with specific functions, to analyze them rather than simply react to them, to apply engineering logic to something biological. The player character is a systems engineer. That alignment is not cosmetic. Isaac Clarke's professional background, his trained instinct for identifying how a system is organized and where its points of failure are, shapes the entire experience of playing the first Dead Space in a way that sits just below the surface of the horror. You are using engineering thinking to survive an engineering problem. The infection isn't chaotic, it has architecture, and the only reason you survive it, in a practical gameplay sense, is because you can read that architecture and find the places where it breaks. The game doesn't tell you that you're practicing exactly the kind of thinking the marker wants from you. That revelation takes 2 more games. Beyond the dismemberment system, Dead Space made a design choice that seems purely atmospheric at first, but carries lore implications that deepen considerably once you understand the larger mythology. The game has no traditional heads-up display. Isaac's health is visible on the back of his suit, a glowing spinal column that depletes as he takes damage. His ammo count appears on his weapons. His inventory exists in a holographic interface projected into the space in front of him within the game world. Nothing appears as an overlay on the player's screen. The information is always embedded in the environment. The effect is that there is no visual separation between the player and Isaac's experience. You are not watching the Ishimura through a frame. You are in it. Your eyes are his eyes. The horror is not filtered through any mediating interface. This matters because of what the marker eventually does to Isaac's mind specifically, and because the game has been conditioning the player to experience that intrusion without any defense against it. When the hallucinations start, when things appear that shouldn't be there, when the environment itself seems to shift according to something other than the physical reality of the ship, the player experiences this the same way Isaac does, There is no meta-level overlay that lets you step back and evaluate. You are inside the signal. The Ishimura itself contributes to this in ways that go beyond the obvious horror of corridors full of necromorphs. The ship was a functioning ecosystem before the outbreak. It had medical bays and engineering decks and mining operations and living quarters. What you move through in the first game is not an abstract horror space. It is a place where people lived and worked and ate and had arguments in the hallways, and now all of it is quiet except for the sound of movement in the dark. Horror built from recognizable spaces, disrupted, tends to land differently than horror built from abstract threat. The Ishimura is recognizable, its structure makes sense. What has been done to it, and to the people in it, is more disturbing precisely because the underlying architecture of a normal working ship remains visible beneath the carnage. Isaac is searching for Nicole Brennan, the medical officer stationed on the Ishimura who had been his girlfriend. Her distress call, in her own voice, was what brought his repair team to the Aegis 7 system. By the time he arrives, the ship is functionally gone. The crew has been consumed and converted. What moves through the corridors wears the shapes of people who, hours ago, were doing ordinary things. Nicole's voice continues to reach him. Her face appears in vents and doorways. She guides him through the chaos, offering information at moments when Isaac would otherwise have no direction. She seems frightened but purposeful. She conveys the impression of someone trying to navigate a disaster she barely understands, while also steering him toward something very specific. She is steering him toward the marker. What the first game reveals at its conclusion changes the entire texture of what the player has just experienced. And the change is one of those revelations that makes you want to replay the entire thing with new eyes. Nicole recorded her final message to Isaac at the moment she understood what was happening aboard the Ishimura, and chose to end her own life rather than let the infection take her. The distress call that brought Isaac's team out to the Aegis 7 system, the voice playing on every channel that led to every death on that mission, belonged to someone already gone. The Nicole that appeared throughout the game, that guided and reassured and directed Isaac, was the marker signal using the image of the person Isaac loved most as a navigational instrument. The marker searched his mind, found the emotional shape it needed, and projected it back at him with enough fidelity to keep him moving toward the outcome the process required. The hallucination was purpose-built from grief. What the marker needed from Isaac, what that navigation was oriented toward, is something the first game presents as a stabilization of the outbreak, a return of the marker to a specific position that would, theoretically, create a field suppressing the necromorph activity. Players are given this objective in good faith by the game's structure, and most complete it without questioning the framing. The marker wants to be returned to its pedestal. Returning it will help, so Isaac returns it. What actually happens when the marker reaches its intended position is the beginning of the convergence conditions. The hive mind arrives. The enormous organism buried deep in the planet below, the entity that has been coordinating the necromorph activity across Aegis 7 through a form of distributed biological intelligence linked to the marker's signal, surfaces and makes its first direct attempt to eliminate Isaac. In the lore's terms, the hive mind serves as the local coordinating node for the marker signal, broadcasting the convergence process to the individual necromorph forms the way a transmitter broadcasts to receivers. Isaac destroys it. He escapes. The convergence process collapses before it can complete, because the biomass was insufficient, the scale of the outbreak too localized, and the hive mind's destruction severed the coordination the marker depended on. He survived because the conditions weren't right, not because he understood what he was preventing. Dr. Chalice Mercer, who Isaac encounters aboard the Ishimura, had watched the entire outbreak unfold and arrived at a conclusion the game presents as madness. Mercer believed the necromorphs were not monsters. He believed the transformation they represented was genuine salvation. He used the word convergence with the reverence of someone who thought he was watching a miracle. He took direct action to protect the process and ensure it could continue. The game presents him as a villain, a man whose grief and religious obsession had carried him past rational thought into dangerous delusion. Hold that framing. Something more complicated lies underneath it, and it becomes visible once you understand what Unitology was actually built on. Most discussions of Dead Space stop with the Ishimura. The first game gets called a contained survival horror story with strong atmosphere and a solid twist. All of that is accurate, except for one detail that changes everything about how Convergence functions. The red marker that caused the Aegis 7 outbreak was a copy. Every red marker in the Dead Space universe is a copy, built by a civilization that encountered the original and replicated it. The original, the one every copy traces back to, was not made by humanity. It arrived on Earth 65 million years ago inside the asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula and ended the age of the dinosaurs. Humanity discovered it in the year 2211 in the crater that impact left behind. What that discovery started, and what it means for the question of whether humanity ever had a genuine choice about participating in Convergence, is where the story actually begins. Chapter 2. What the Church Promised. Michael Altman was not who the Church of Unitology says he was. Unitology's official account presents Altman as a prophet, a man chosen by the marker to receive its truth and carry it to a species not yet ready to hear it. A martyr killed for what he tried to share. Someone the Church invokes the way religious institutions invoke their founders, as evidence that the belief began with a person of exceptional clarity rather than with an organization that had specific things to gain from the narrative it was constructing. The actual account of Michael Altman is considerably more uncomfortable than the version the Church distributes. He was a geophysicist. When a signal was detected emanating from the Chicxulub crater, Altman was part of the research team assembled to investigate it. The crater itself had been there for 65 million years, the scar left by the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period and eliminated most of the large species that had dominated Earth until that moment. At the bottom of that ancient wound, buried through all of recorded history, was the black marker, still functional, still broadcasting the same signal it had been transmitting since before any member of Altman's species had evolved to receive it. The artifact appeared extraordinary in every measurable way. Its electromagnetic output was enormous. Its structure was unlike any known material formation. Its surface carried a complex system of symbols that initial analysis couldn't fully categorize, though early work suggested the symbol system might encode some form of information. The research project assembled to study it treated the discovery as potentially the most significant scientific find in human history, which it was, though not in any of the ways the initial optimism imagined. Extended exposure began changing the assessment. Some members of the research team started hearing voices. Some developed an overwhelming compulsion to protect the marker from interference or removal. Some began producing the marker's symbols without instruction, covering available surfaces with a language no living human had ever been taught, but that certain minds could apparently absorb through proximity alone. The effect was not universal. Some team members experienced the signal as destabilizing, as a progressive deterioration of their grip on what was real and what wasn't. Others experienced something different, something the franchise would eventually describe as compatibility. A compatible mind doesn't break under the marker's signal. A compatible mind receives it. The signal, which for most people manifests as dementia, as hallucination, as the erosion of the distinction between interior and exterior experience, for a small subset of minds manifests as clarity, as instruction, as a set of blueprints for something that needs to be built. The symbols they compulsively produce are not random. They are technical documents. The things they start to understand are not mystical. They are architectural. Altman went public with the discovery against the government project's explicit instructions, revealing the marker's existence to the world before the project had determined how to manage that information. His reasons were complex, and the accounts of his motivations suggest genuine moral conflict rather than simple heroism. What followed his disclosure was political disruption that the project overseeing the black marker had not prepared for. Shortly after, Altman was killed. Two men connected to the original project, a psychologist named Stevens and a former military official named Markov, framed his death as government assassination. They positioned him as a martyr for a truth the world had tried to suppress. They published materials under his name, selecting carefully which details from his actual research became public, and built a narrative around him that served their purposes precisely. The Church of Unitology, officially founded in 2154, was constructed on a fabricated story about a man who never wanted it. Altman had not been trying to start a religion. He had been trying to warn people. The men who killed him then used his death to build the institution best positioned to advance the marker's agenda for the next 2 centuries, and to distribute the marker's influence across a civilization that would otherwise have quarantined or destroyed it. This foundation matters enormously to understanding convergence, because it reveals how the marker's influence scales beyond the individual. The marker does not only affect minds directly exposed to it. The compulsion it creates in compatible people, that overwhelming sense of purpose and meaning, produces individuals who go out and build institutions. They organize, they construct belief systems that carry the marker's priorities outward to populations who have never been within 1,000 miles of the artifact itself. Unitology became the mechanism through which the marker's requirements were distributed across an entire civilization. Research on apocalyptic belief systems has identified something consistently counterintuitive in how communities organized around end times expectations function internally. What looks, from outside those communities, like fear or desperation often functions internally as something closer to relief. The expectation that the world will end in transformation, rather than simply ceasing to exist, provides a framework in which death carries meaning, in which individual suffering serves a larger purpose, in which the dissolution of the self becomes reunion rather than loss. Communities that had predicted specific dates for world-ending events, and watched those dates pass without incident, typically did not collapse. They reinterpreted, they preserved the emotional architecture of the framework even when the specific prediction failed, because the need the framework was meeting was real even when the timeline was wrong. Unitology had the same psychological structure as those movements. Every element that made apocalyptic belief psychologically durable was present in its theology. The difference was that the transformative event it had organized itself around was genuine. The phrase the marker broadcast into the minds of everyone within its influence was, "Make us whole." For Unitologists, this phrase carried the weight of a promise. It meant reunion with loved ones lost to death. It meant the end of grief, the end of the separation that dying creates between people. It described a community without loss, without isolation, without the fundamental aloneness that being a separate consciousness inside a body entails. The emotional precision of that promise was not accidental. Every human being carries grief. Every mind that has loved anyone has experienced separation from that person as a wound that doesn't fully close. The marker found those wounds and spoke directly into them. Unitologists preserved the bodies of their deceased rather than cremating them, keeping them in their understanding whole and ready for the convergence to come. They celebrated death as transition rather than mourning it as ending. During periods of marker activity, when the signal intensified and the effects on exposed minds became more acute, Unitologists interpreted the resulting behavior, even the self-destructive behavior, as the first steps toward the promised ascension. The suicides that occurred near active markers were understood within the Church's framework as believers choosing to go ahead rather than wait. The Church's practices, which from outside looked like a death-worshipping organization with increasingly dangerous ideology, were from inside a coherent theology built around a specific and internally consistent understanding of what convergence would deliver. That understanding was the marker's most successful long-term project. Think about what that means structurally. A religion built around the celebration of corpse preservation and the embrace of death ensures that the marker has a protected supply of both. It ensures that the communities most likely to encounter markers are the communities least likely to destroy them, the ones who would shield them, who would carry them from place to place, who would embed marker research within institutions with the resources and the motivation to advance it. The Church of Unitology had deep financial relationships with major corporations. It had political influence that extended into governments. It had members at every level of the civilizational infrastructure that would be needed to spread markers to new locations. Unitology didn't just believe in convergence. For 2 centuries before the Aegis 7 outbreak, it was doing the preparatory work. Here is a comparison that sharpens this. The Reapers in the Mass Effect franchise harvest intelligent civilizations on a cycle. Their stated justification, revealed eventually across that series, is that they are preserving organic life by converting it before a conflict between organic and synthetic intelligence can destroy it. The harvest is framed as a mercy. The essence of the consumed individuals, the Reapers claim, continues within the Reaper that consumed them. They offer continuation in a different form. Unitologists told themselves a version of that story about convergence, that the transformation was real, that what came after was genuinely the people they had been, reunited and made whole in the way the marker promised. The Brethren Moons, the entities convergence actually creates, offer nothing of the kind. There is no preserved essence. There is no continuation of individual identity within the organism that the convergence builds. The organic material consumed in a convergence event is converted into the biological mass of a new predator. The intelligence of the resulting moon belongs to the moon. Whatever the people who were consumed had been, whatever they had loved and grieved and hoped for, does not persist in any form the word persistent meaningfully applies to. The Reapers lie to their victims about what the harvest is for. The Brethren Moons simply don't address the question. Unitology built its own comfortable answer and lived inside it for generations. Chalice Mercer, watching the crew of the Ishimura be destroyed and converted around him, was not simply a broken man who had lost his mind. He was the logical endpoint of a belief system that had been designed, through the marker's influence on Stevens and Markov and everyone who came after them, to produce exactly that kind of response when the moment finally arrived. A man whose entire framework of meaning had been organized around this event, who had been given the theological language to experience it as sacred rather than catastrophic. His certainty was the marker's influence operating through the architecture of 2 centuries of institutional religion. Understanding Unitology as the marker's most effective long-term creation changes how every Unitologist in the series reads. The Ishimura's captain, who organized the planet Crack partly to retrieve the red marker, the Unitologist agents embedded in EarthGov who worked to protect marker research and prevent its shutdown, Jacob Danik, who in Dead Space 3 actively works to reactivate the frozen Tau Volantis moon and restart a galaxy-wide convergence, believing with complete sincerity that he is saving humanity from itself. Danik is not a zealot acting from simple delusion. He is someone shaped over a lifetime by a belief system that was itself shaped by a signal whose true purpose he has never understood. His actions are rational within his framework. His framework was constructed by the thing he worships. The thing he worships will consume him. The marker built a church. The church built believers. The believers spread the markers to new locations. The markers spread the infection. The infection gathered bodies. The bodies fed the convergence. Religion and necromorph outbreak are not 2 different processes the marker is running simultaneously. They are 2 phases of the same continuous operation. This creates a question the first 2 games build toward without quite answering directly. Why did the marker need the religion at all? If the necromorph infection can handle conversion directly, if the outbreak is sufficient to gather the biomass required, why construct an entire belief system around death as transition and corpse preservation and the spread of markers across civilization? The answer goes deeper than bodies or protected markers or institutional infrastructure. Markers need makers. Red markers, every red marker that has ever appeared in the Dead Space universe, were built by intelligent civilizations. The genetic and structural blueprints for constructing them are encoded in the black marker's surface, embedded in the same symbol system that also contains the instructions for creating the necromorph pathogen. Certain minds, the ones that don't destabilize under the marker's signal but instead begin to read it with something approaching fluency, receive those blueprints as though they are remembering something they always knew. They understand the symbols. They experience an overwhelming drive to apply that understanding, to build the thing the blueprints describe. These are marker makers. The convergence process specifically requires them. A red marker can create necromorphs. It can spread the infection. It can gather biomass and coordinate the outbreak's progression. But when the time for the final step comes, when the convergence event is ready to complete, the red marker requires the deaths of its makers, the specific people whose minds received and replicated the blueprints. Their bodies feed the moon at the moment of completion in a way that ordinary biomass cannot. Isaac Clarke is one of these people. His brain is compatible with the marker signal in exactly the way that produces marker makers rather than marker victims. His engineering background isn't incidental to this. The kind of mind that builds systems, that reads complex technical specifications, and understands how components relate to function, is the kind of mind the marker signal can interface with most productively. The signal doesn't need a poet. It needs someone who can look at a blueprint and build what it describes. Understanding why Isaac specifically has this kind of mind, what made humanity produce people like him in the first place, requires going back much further than Unitology, further than Michael Altman's discovery of the black marker in 2215, further than any century of recorded human history. Because if the black marker arrived on Earth 65 million years ago and has been shaping the trajectory of life on this planet since that impact, then the question of where that marker came from, who sent it, and what it was designed to accomplish before it even landed becomes the most important question the franchise ever asks. The answer has been in orbit above Tau Volantis for 2 million years, frozen, waiting, completely aware of exactly how long it has been waiting. Most people understand that as setup for the third game. This video is going to spend the next several hours arguing that it's the entire thesis of all three games, and that almost every character who ever engaged with the marker, whether to study it, worship it, or destroy it, was oriented toward a conclusion they had already been built to reach. Chapter 3: The Signal in Everything. There is a question that physics has never been able to answer cleanly, and the longer it goes unanswered, the more disturbing the silence around it becomes. The universe is, as best as science can measure, somewhere in the vicinity of 13.5 billion years old. Earth has been here for roughly 4.5 billion of those years. The gap between when life first appeared on this planet and the present moment is so enormous it defies intuitive comprehension. And in all of that time, in all of the galaxies containing all of the stars, with all of those stars potentially hosting all of the worlds where chemistry could have organized itself into something that could eventually look up, ask questions, and build radio telescopes, not one signal has ever arrived that science can confidently attribute to something other than natural physics. No transmission, no probe, no artifact, no response to anything we have ever broadcast into the dark. Physicists and astronomers call this the Fermi paradox, named for the physicist who first articulated the unease of the question. If the universe is as large and as old and as potentially full of opportunity as our best measurements suggest, the silence from outside our solar system is profoundly strange. The options generally proposed are not comfortable ones. Perhaps life is rare in ways we don't yet understand. Perhaps intelligence is rarer still. Perhaps civilizations tend to destroy themselves before reaching the point where they could broadcast across interstellar distances. Dead Space has a different answer, and it puts the answer in the mouth of a dying man, frozen on an alien planet, who understood too late that he was looking at the evidence of something that had been operating for longer than humanity had existed. Earl Serrano, the lead scientist on the Sovereign Colony's expedition to Tau Volantis, spent years studying the ruins left behind by the alien civilization that had once inhabited that world. 2 million years of evidence. fossils and architecture, and the scattered remnants of a culture sophisticated enough to have built machinery that froze an entire planet. His conclusion, documented in logs left behind after his death, was this: the reason humanity had never detected other intelligent life in the galaxy was not because intelligent life was rare. It was because the moons had already found it. Every civilization advanced enough to build radio telescopes, to look up at the sky and wonder about contact, was a civilization already marked for harvest. What remained after the moons had finished was not a galaxy full of quiet stars and empty planets. It was a galaxy in a state of dead space. That phrase sits at the center of the franchise's entire mythology. The title is not about horror or emptiness in the abstract sense. It is a specific and exact description of what happens to a galaxy after the Brethren moons have worked through it. The civilizations are gone. The planets they built on are stripped. The genetic material of every species absorbed has been folded into the moon's uniform biomass, mixed and compressed and converted, until there is nothing left that could be described as life in the sense we mean when we use that word. Dead space, no life, no contact, no answer, and the reason humanity never noticed, the reason no one in any century of recorded history looked at the silence of the universe and correctly identified it as the aftermath of a feeding event, is that the moons had left something behind in the places they visited, not as an oversight, as a next step. A black marker in the Yucatan, buried deep beneath what would one day be called the Chicxulub crater, buried for 65 million years, waiting for something capable of finding it. Consider what the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period actually was, stripped of everything that happened after. A mass extinction. The elimination of most large-bodied species from an entire planet. The clearing of an ecological landscape that had been dominated for over 100 million years by creatures whose scale and metabolic requirements left little space for the small, fast-reproducing, cognitively flexible mammals that would eventually give rise to the primate line. The impact created the conditions for human evolution. Within the lore of Dead Space, one of the more disturbing speculations attributed to Jacob Danik, the Circle leader in Dead Space 3, is that the markers may do more than simply wait for a civilization to develop. He speculates that the markers may actively influence evolutionary trajectories, that the presence of a black marker on a planet may nudge the development of life in specific directions, encouraging the emergence of exactly the kind of intelligence the markers need to fulfill the next phase of the process. The franchise's creative team confirmed that the revelation connecting the black marker to human evolution, crystallized in Dead Space 3, was inspired by the ancient astronaut concept, the idea long discussed in speculative circles that extraterrestrial influence shaped humanity's development. The parallel is deliberate and uncomfortable, because if the monolith in Arthur Clarke's vision guided early hominids toward intelligence by triggering a cognitive leap, it did so toward something transcendent and open. The Dead Space version of that trigger was guiding humanity toward intelligence, specifically so that intelligence could build the tools of its own consumption. The black marker buried in the Yucatan did not evolve a species, it cultivated one. 65 million years is a long time to wait. It is also, in the logic of the moon's strategy, exactly as long as necessary. A moon is not impatient. A moon does not have a schedule disrupted by waiting. The moon that eventually sent the black marker to Earth, or that allowed it to travel embedded in an asteroid, was operating on a timescale where millions of years between the planting and the harvest was not an inconvenience. It was part of the design. You need the species to develop. You need it to reach the level of technological sophistication required to build red markers. You need it to organize itself into civilizations capable of spreading those copies across multiple star systems, because a convergence on a single planet produces one moon, but a civilization that has spread itself across dozens of worlds is a buffet rather than a meal. The marker was never in a hurry, it just needed the conditions to be right. In the year 2073, those conditions became right. Michael Altman's team descended into the Chicxulub crater and found the black marker exactly as it had been left 65 million years earlier, broadcasting into a world that had finally produced something capable of hearing it clearly. The signal it was broadcasting was not an alarm. It was not a distress call. It was an instruction manual. The symbols on the black marker's surface contained two distinct categories of information encoded in the same symbol system. The first is the genetic and biochemical instructions for creating the necromorph pathogen, the template the infection follows when it reshapes dead tissue into the forms the marker requires. The second is the architectural blueprint for building new markers. Both are written in the same language. Both are transmitted through the same signal. For most minds, the signal arrives as noise, as a progressive disruption of the distinction between real and imagined, as voices and images that don't correspond to anything physically present. For a small subset of minds, the signal arrives as something else entirely, something that functions less like an intrusion and more like a memory of instructions you hadn't known you were carrying. These are the people who start drawing the symbols compulsively, who understand, below the level of conscious thought, how the components fit together, who can look at the symbol system and know what it is describing, who feel, with a certainty that goes deeper than belief, that what the marker is asking them to build is something they were always meant to build. The franchise eventually identifies a specific neurological basis for this compatibility. The Noonlight Diagnostics Machine, used by EarthGov researchers on Titan Station to probe the minds of people who had been imprinted by marker exposure, taps into the lateral geniculate nucleus, the region of the human brain responsible for processing visual information from the eyes. This is the location where the marker's blueprint information embeds itself. The symbols aren't hallucinated in the conventional sense. They are stored there, in the brain's visual processing architecture, as though they were always part of how that mind worked. Researchers who studied these patients described the experience as looking at memories that came from somewhere outside the patient's own life. The patients could navigate the symbol system. They could explain what specific sequences meant. They could, given the right resources and environment, produce new markers from scratch. Isaac Clarke is one of these people. His exposure to the red marker on the Ishimura embedded the blueprint in his mind. His experience of the signal was severe, producing hallucinations and emotional disturbances that persisted long after he left the Ishimura. But his mind did not break in the way most minds broke. He received, he remembered, and in the 3 years following the Ishimura incident, while he was held in EarthGov's medical facility on Titan Station, the researchers studying him concluded something that changed their entire research program. They described his mind as the purest of all the marker-imprinted individuals they had studied. The signal embedded in Isaac was not degraded by his experience, not distorted by the trauma, or corrupted by the competing effects of extended marker exposure. Whatever his mind was doing when it interfaced with the marker, it was doing it with a clarity that none of the other surviving subjects could match. EarthGov decided to use this. The project they assembled around Isaac Clarke's imprinted mind was called Project Telomere. The goal was to extract the marker's blueprint codes from his neural architecture using the Noonlight Diagnostics Machine and use them to build a new marker, a marker under human control, a marker that could be studied, understood, and eventually weaponized. The irony of that goal is something we'll need to sit with for a moment, because it contains the entire logic of how the marker has always operated. Every government project that tried to control a marker, from the original black marker discovery and the project Altman's team was part of, to EarthGov's own research divisions scattered across the solar system, was convinced that the distinction between the marker's purposes and their own purposes was meaningful, that the marker could be contained, that the intelligence they were dealing with was an artifact rather than an agent. Every one of those projects produced exactly the outcome the marker required. There is a concept in biology called the parasitoid relationship, different from a parasite, which typically feeds on a host while keeping it alive. A parasitoid organism uses another species as a host, but ultimately kills it in the process of completing its own life cycle. Certain wasps, for example, inject their eggs into living caterpillars. The eggs develop inside the host, feeding on it while the host continues to function normally, continues to eat, continues to move, continues to behave as if its situation is ordinary. The caterpillar does not experience this as an emergency. From its perspective, as much as it has a perspective, nothing catastrophic is happening. Then the eggs hatch. The larvae consume the host from the inside as they develop. By the time the wasps emerge, the caterpillar is gone. What looked like a living thing was carrying something else's future the entire time. The marker's relationship to intelligent civilizations operates with a similar structure, scaled up to the scope of a species rather than an individual organism. The civilization develops, it discovers the marker. The marker's signal embeds itself in compatible minds. Those minds build more markers, which spread the signal further, which finds more compatible minds, which build more markers. The civilization grows. It spreads across multiple worlds. The necromorph pathogen follows. The infection converts enough bodies to trigger the convergence process. The civilization that thought it was thriving was carrying something else's future the entire time. This is why the Fermi paradox has no reassuring answer in the dead space universe. The reason no civilization has ever transmitted a signal we could receive is not because civilizations are rare. It is because by the time a civilization is advanced enough to transmit, the process that will eventually consume it is already underway. The signal is already in the planet. The marker is already being found. The religion is already forming. The outbreaks are already happening in the remote corners of the system where no one is looking closely yet. The universe is quiet because the moons have not left anyone to speak. Serrano's logs from Tau Volantis suggest he understood this, that the realization broke something in him before it clarified everything. In his framing, the aliens whose ruins he was excavating were not an isolated tragedy. They were evidence of a pattern, a single data point in a series that extended across the entire galaxy and possibly beyond. Every species that ever evolved to the point of discovering a marker representing one more civilization that was already in the process of becoming something else. The genetic material of all of them, Serrano speculated, had been folded into the moon's biomass. What roamed the dark between stars was not life in any sense that would allow for contact. It was the accumulated remains of everything that had ever tried. Understanding this changes what Isaac Clarke represents in the franchise's mythology. He is not a survivor, or rather, survivorship is not the most significant thing about him. He is the product of a process that started 65 million years before his birth, a mind shaped, through human evolution's entire trajectory, to be the kind of mind that could receive and replicate the marker's blueprints with exceptional clarity. The franchise's creative team, in reflecting on the original planned direction for the story, noted that Isaac was conceived as a specific type of individual within the necromorph ecological system. The version they called What the Necromorph Ecology Looks Like in Its Prey Species is someone whose brain is structured to help the moons find and consume the rest of the inhabited planets. He is the advanced scout that didn't know he was scouting. And EarthGov, in extracting those blueprints from his mind and building a new marker from them, achieved something remarkable. They completed the marker's next move without realizing that was what they were doing. There's something about what EarthGov built on the sprawl that most discussions of Dead Space 2 skip past without examining fully. The Site-12 marker was not found. It was not stolen or excavated or recovered from some distant planet. It was constructed by human engineers working from blueprints extracted from a human mind. Every component was manufactured in human facilities using human materials. The obelisk that caused the outbreak on the sprawl, that triggered a convergence attempt on a station with a population in the hundreds of thousands, was built by the civilization it was designed to consume from the inside. Think about what a prison you would need to escape. If the prison were not a physical space, but a template written into the architecture of your own thinking. The markers don't threaten from outside a civilization. They don't arrive as weapons. They arrive as seeds, take root in the minds of the most compatible people in that civilization, and then wait while those people do exactly what they are designed to do. The prison the markers build is one where the walls are made of the prisoner's own intelligence and creativity. Isaac Clarke built his own marker. EarthGov helped him. The question of what those 3 years on Titan Station looked like for Isaac is something the second game communicates almost entirely through implication. He wakes with no memory of them, stripped away by the suppressants administered after each extraction session. What reconstructed evidence suggests is not comfortable. The Noonlight diagnostics machine was not a gentle instrument. 3 years of sessions, each followed by memory suppression designed to prevent Isaac from understanding what was being done to him, left him in a state where the dream and the waking were beginning to blur at the edges. Nicole was there the whole time. Her image, constructed by the marker signal still present in his mind, had never left after the Ishimura. It had simply been managed and suppressed alongside everything else. When the suppressants failed, when the outbreak began and the carefully maintained pharmaceutical equilibrium collapsed, Nicole came back with full force. The second game is, in its deepest structure, a story about whether Isaac can tell the difference between what he loves and what is using his love against him. Chapter 4: The Maker Must Die. The sprawl was a city that had forgotten it was a monument. Titan Station, built into the last remaining fragment of Titan after that moon was planet-cracked, had grown through layers of construction into a metropolis home to hundreds of thousands of people. Schools, shopping levels, residential sectors stacked above each other in the low gravity of the fragment's inner curve. A Unitologist church, visible from most public spaces, its architecture echoing the double helix shape of the artifact its congregation worshipped. The sprawl was, by any ordinary measure, a place where people lived ordinary lives, and the secret buried in its government sector, the enormous marker that EarthGov had spent 3 years constructing from Isaac's extracted memories, was not something those ordinary lives had any knowledge of. Isaac woke into the middle of the outbreak with no memory of being there, no knowledge of what had been done to him, and no idea why the dead were beginning to move. The disorientation is the game's opening condition, and it mirrors the disorientation that the entire franchise produces when you look at it from outside the moment of each individual crisis. Every character who has ever encountered the marker has done so without the context that would allow them to understand what the encounter actually means. EarthGov built the Site-12 marker without understanding that it was completing the marker's plan rather than its own. Isaac survived the Ishimura without understanding that his survival was the marker's preferred outcome. Unitologists worshipped Convergence without understanding what it would mean for them to finally see it arrive. Everyone in the franchise is waking up into the middle of something they don't have the context for. Nolan Strauss had been held in the same facility, where Isaac's exposure to the marker on Aegis 7 had come through direct contact with the red marker retrieved by the Ishimura. Strauss had been contaminated through contact with a fragment of that same artifact retrieved from a follow-up mission. The fragment had resonated with his mind enough to make him a partial marker maker, someone whose neural architecture contained pieces of the blueprint, even if not the full, clear version Isaac carried. EarthGov had used both of them, along with at least 3 other subjects, in the construction of the Site-12 marker, treating their minds as a collective resource to be mined across repeated sessions. Strauss is, in the second game, a portrait of what extended marker exposure does to a mind that receives the signal partially rather than cleanly. Where Isaac's compatibility allowed him to carry the blueprint with some degree of functionality, Strauss carried it in fragments. His behavior across the game is the behavior of someone whose mind has been organized around marker logic without the clarity to navigate that logic coherently. He understands, in his better moments, what the marker is and what he and Isaac need to do to destroy it. He has brief windows of purposefulness. Between those windows, the hallucinatory pressure of the marker's signal, plus whatever weight of personal grief he was carrying into the experience, had been doing damage that 3 years of experimental extraction made considerably worse. Strauss is what happens to a marker maker who gets broken in the process rather than kept intact. Isaac, by comparison, was preserved more carefully because his mind was more valuable. Director Hans Tiedemann, overseeing Project Telomere, understood that Isaac's unusual compatibility made him the foundation of the entire project. Damaging him too severely would compromise the extraction results. This is why the memory suppressants were used. This is why Isaac's physical condition was maintained. Tiedemann needed Isaac functional, which meant keeping him alive in a state where he didn't fully understand what was being done to him. The marker had a parallel interest in keeping Isaac alive, for reasons that had nothing to do with EarthGov's research goals. The Nicole construct that Isaac carried through the years on Titan Station, that appeared during whatever fragments of unmedicated sleep the suppressants allowed, was not simply a hallucination driven by unprocessed grief. It was the marker's signal working actively in his mind, using the emotional image it had found during the Ishimura incident because that image had proven effective at directing Isaac's behavior. The construct cycled through strategies across Dead Space 2 in a way that reveals the marker's operational logic more clearly than almost anything else in the franchise. Early in the game, the Nicole apparition is destabilizing. She appears in distorted, disturbing forms, calculated to break down Isaac's composure and make him more susceptible to the signal's influence. This is the marker using grief as a blunt instrument, trying to prevent Isaac from being able to think clearly enough to act against its interests. When that approach proves insufficient, the Nicole construct shifts. She becomes more functional, more like guidance, more like someone trying to help Isaac reach the marker's location. The marker had learned from the Ishimura. It understood that Isaac responded better to the experience of being guided by Nicole than to the experience of being threatened by her image, so it offered him what he responded to. The goal in both phases was the same: getting Isaac to the Site 12 marker at the moment of convergence, so that he could be absorbed as the makers must be absorbed to complete the process. This is the specific requirement that makes red markers functionally different from black markers in the convergence process. A black marker, like the one buried on Aegis 7, carries enough of its own signal strength to initiate convergence without depending on the deaths of specific individuals. But a red marker, built by an intelligent civilization from blueprints embedded in specific compatible minds, has a different dependency structure. The makers must be absorbed. The people whose neural architecture provided the template for the artifact's construction need to be present and consumed at the moment of convergence completion. Their deaths feed the nascent moon in a way that closes the circuit between the marker and the cosmic network it is trying to join. Isaac and Strauss were both required. The Ubermorph, the single necromorph form in Dead Space 2 that cannot be permanently destroyed, only momentarily halted, that regenerates endlessly and pursues Isaac with a persistence that ordinary necromorphs don't demonstrate, was the marker's contingency plan. If Isaac could not be drawn to the convergence willingly, if the Nicole construct failed at the crucial moment, the Ubermorph would kill him. A dead maker was still a maker. A dead body that had contained the blueprint could still feed the convergence. The same way a seed broken apart during planting still delivers what the ground requires. The marker wanted Isaac absorbed. It did not particularly require that he consent to the process. What Isaac did in the final sequence of Dead Space 2 is worth understanding precisely because it's one of the places where the franchise rewards very careful attention. He reaches the marker. The Site 12 marker is fully activated. The convergence vortex is building. The necromorphs are gathering around the artifact in the circle pattern that the lore identifies as the precursor to the Convergence Event, the dead space calm inside the storm. The Nicole construct, which has been presenting itself as an ally in the final approach, drops that presentation completely once Isaac is at the marker. She reveals what the process actually requires. The makers must be absorbed. Isaac's defeat of the Nicole construct happens not in the physical space of Titan Station, but in his own mind, in a confrontation that the game renders as a last psychic battle between Isaac's grief and the marker's exploitation of that grief. He accepts, in that moment, that Nicole is gone. He accepts that the image he has been responding to across 2 games was never her. and in accepting it, in refusing the emotional manipulation the marker had been running on him since the Ishimura, he severs the marker's ability to complete the convergence through him. The marker crumbles. The Site-12 marker breaks apart. The convergence on Titan Station fails. But here is what that victory actually changed, and what it didn't. And this is the part of Dead Space 2 that the game's generally action-oriented final act tends to obscure. The marker is destroyed. The blueprint that generated it, however, still exists in Isaac's mind. The signal that embedded those codes in his neural architecture 2 games ago has not been removed. The marker making him a marker maker was not undone when he shattered the artifact he had made. Isaac Clarke walked away from Titan Station, still carrying the most complete, undistorted set of marker blueprints that any human mind had ever held. The moons, wherever they were, still had their maker. He had just changed locations. And in the darkness of the outer solar system, far beyond the orbits of any inhabited world, something that had been frozen for 2 million years was beginning to send a clearer signal than it had managed in all of that time. Something that felt, in the lore's treatment of it, like desperation, like a thing that had been waiting through almost unimaginable duration and had now detected the specific conditions it had been waiting for. The signal said, "Make us whole." It said, "Turn it off." 2 instructions that seemed contradictory to everyone who received them, and that only made sense once you understood who was sending them and what they had been waiting for. On a frozen planet in a distant star system, 2 million years ago, a civilization that had understood exactly what the marker was doing did the only thing they could think of to stop it. They built a machine to stop convergence. They succeeded, partially. Their success left a gap in the process, and the thing they had partially stopped had been filling that gap with signals ever since, reaching outward through every active marker in the galaxy, looking for a compatible mind that could be guided to the one place where the process could be resumed. It found Isaac Clarke. Whether that was luck, or whether it was the result of the moons having seeded exactly the right planet 65 million years ago with exactly that goal in mind, is a question the franchise leaves deliberately unanswered. Both possibilities lead to the same place. Isaac was going to Tau Volantis. He just didn't understand why yet, and when he got there, what he found was the evidence that everything humanity had experienced with the markers, every outbreak and every religion and every government program and every close call, was not unique. It was a pattern, one that had played out before, on a world covered in water 2 million years ago, with a civilization that built an entirely different kind of machine in response. A machine that worked, for a while, and left behind a planet of ice and bones and a frozen moon in orbit that was fully conscious and absolutely certain that the wait was almost over. Chapter 5, The Planet That Tried. 2 million years is a number that resists imagination. To put it in proportion, modern humans have existed for somewhere in the range of 300,000 years. The entire span of recorded human civilization, from the first writing to the present, covers roughly 5,000 years. 2 million years before the events of Dead Space 3, the universe was already a place where civilizations had risen, discovered the markers, built everything the markers wanted them to build, and been consumed. The world the Dead Space franchise takes place in is not the beginning of the convergence process. It is an extremely late chapter in a story that started so long ago that humanity, when it finally encountered the evidence of what came before, had no frame of reference for the timescale it was looking at. Tau Volantis used to be a world of water. Before the black marker arrived, before anything changed, Tau Volantis was an ocean planet. Its surface was covered by seas containing the full ecological complexity that produces intelligence over long evolutionary periods. Its inhabitants were semi-aquatic, adapted to move through both water and whatever land their world offered, and over the course of their civilization's development, they had reached a level of social and technological sophistication comparable, in some respects, to what humanity would eventually achieve. They built structures, they organized. Evidence in their ruins, uncovered by human researchers 2 million years after the fact, suggests their civilization may have been widespread rather than limited to a single world. spanning a system rather than inhabiting a single planet. They looked up at their sky and wondered about what was out there. At some point in their history, a black marker arrived on their world. The exact circumstances aren't recorded in anything the franchise makes available. What is known is that the experience of discovering it was not dramatically different from the experience of humanity discovering the Chicxulub marker. The artifact generated massive amounts of energy. Its surface contained a symbol system that some minds could begin to navigate. The compulsion to replicate it was generated by the signal it broadcast, and the civilization's structures were sophisticated enough that those minds had the resources and infrastructure to actually build new markers. Red markers began appearing across the planet's surface. The promise of limitless energy and the marker's effect on minds already disposed toward religious experience combined, presumably, into something that looked, from the inside, like progress. What followed is something the lore describes in the past tense, with the distance of 2 million years between the event and the discovery of its aftermath. The convergence triggered. Enough biomass had been converted into necromorphs, and enough bodies had died in the infection, and the secondary violence it generated, that the black marker's critical threshold was reached. The vortex began. The dead of Tau Volantis started rising into orbit, and then something happened that had apparently never happened before in the Brethren Moon's feeding history. A civilization fought back with a plan that actually worked, partially. The survivors of the Tau Volantis civilization, who had not yet been converted or killed, understood what they were watching. Whether they had decoded the marker's symbols and understood the process intellectually, or whether witnessing the convergence in real time gave them enough information to act on, the historical record doesn't clarify. What the record does confirm is that some number of them, working against whatever time remained to them, built the machine. Calling it a machine understates what it was. The structure buried beneath Tau Volantis's frozen surface, discovered 2,000 years later by the Sovereign Colonies expedition and encountered by Isaac Clarke in the third game, covers an area that functions more accurately as a city. Its architecture integrated the bodies of the Tau Volantis aliens directly into its structure. The first human researchers to see it described figures that looked like statuary, distributed throughout the complex, incorporated into the walls and supports and functional surfaces of the device. Closer examination confirmed that these were not artistic representations. They were the actual bodies of the species, calcified in place, preserved within the machine's architecture, in a configuration that served the device's function, rather than any commemorative purpose. The aliens didn't build the machine and then die. They built it around themselves as they died. Their bodies became part of its mechanism. What the machine was designed to do had two stages. The first was the freezing of the planet, a flash cooling of the entire world that would arrest the convergence in progress by removing the conditions the process depended on to continue. The second stage, the one the aliens never reached, was the final configuration that would have pulled the half-formed moon out of its orbit and crashed it into the planet's surface, destroying it before it could complete its formation and join the moon's wider network. The first stage worked. The planet froze. The convergence stopped mid-process. The moon, caught in its half-formed state, entered a period of dormancy that preserved it in orbit above the frozen world. The second stage was never executed, because by the time the machine was ready for it, the aliens were gone. There is a concept, studied in philosophy and moral theory, called self-annihilating sacrifice. It describes an act of giving where what you surrender is not just valuable to you, but necessary for your continued existence as the thing you are. It differs from ordinary sacrifice in that the giver is not exchanging one kind of continuity for another. There is no form they persist in after. The sacrifice is total. The Tau Volantis civilization understood this in a way that makes their choice almost impossible to fully absorb. They activated a machine that would end them, not to save themselves, but to prevent the convergence process from continuing outward to other worlds. They eliminated themselves, as Serrano's logs put it, like a body cutting away an infected limb before the infection can reach vital organs. They chose to die so that the thing they had unwillingly become part of would stop spreading, and they almost succeeded in making their sacrifice permanent. If the machine had been reconfigured to complete its second stage, the moon above Tau Volantis would have been destroyed. Its signal would have gone silent. The marker signals it was broadcasting through the red markers scattered across the galaxy would have ceased. The Brethren moon's ability to reach new civilizations and trigger new convergences would have been reduced to whatever the other moons could accomplish without the Tau Volantis moon's contribution. Instead, the moon stayed in orbit, incomplete, frozen, aware. 2 million years of awareness in a body that couldn't act, 2 million years of sending signals through every active marker in its network, reaching for any compatible mind that might find its way to the planet. Any mind that might hear the phrase, "turn it off," and interpret it as an instruction rather than a plea. In the year 2314, the sovereign colony's armed forces arrived at Tau Volantis. They came looking for the source of the marker signals, believing, as most human research programs believed, that whoever had made the markers could be found and studied and potentially negotiated with. They brought a fleet and a science division and the resources for a long-term expedition. Dr. Earl Serrano led the civilian research component of that expedition. His early logs, discovered 200 years later by Isaac Clarke's team, depict a scientist in the grip of genuine wonder. He was, in the early months, excavating what appeared to be an entirely new chapter in the history of intelligent life: alien fossils, alien architecture, evidence of a civilization sophisticated enough to have built structures that had survived 2 million years of freezing planetary conditions. His initial assumption, shared by the expedition leadership, was that the Tau Volantis civilization had created the markers. The more he learned, the more that assumption broke down. The red markers on Tau Volantis were identical in structure to the ones humanity had built. The symbol system on their surfaces matched. The compulsion they generated in human researchers exposed to them was the same compulsion the black marker on Earth generated. And when Serrano began to excavate more carefully, when the true scale of the alien city beneath the planet's surface became visible, and when the relationship between the alien bodies incorporated into the machine's architecture started to become clear, he realized what the expedition had actually found: another victim. The Tau Volantis civilization had not made the markers. A black marker had arrived on their world, the same way a black marker had been buried on Earth. The same compulsion had operated on their compatible minds. The same religion had likely formed, possibly with different symbology and different vocabulary, but built on the same signal and pointed toward the same conclusion. The same infection had spread. The same convergence had begun. The only difference was the machine. Rosetta was the specimen that changed everything. Found frozen and preserved in conditions that had prevented the necromorph pathogen from converting the body. Rosetta was one of the Tau Volantis aliens, intact enough that Serrano's team could study it in detail and eventually probe its memories with equipment that had never been designed for anything so extraordinary. What they accessed through Rosetta's preserved neural tissue was both a warning and an instruction. The machine needed a specific key, a codex, built from the biological information encoded in the Tau Volantis aliens' own genetic material, their DNA, and specifically the unaltered DNA of a specimen not yet converted by the necromorph pathogen, was the interface that would allow a new codex to operate the machine. Rosetta was the only specimen they had ever found that fit that requirement. Serrano understood what this meant for the machine's second stage function, the capability the aliens had built into the device but never completed. With a properly configured codex, the machine could be reconfigured, not just to maintain the freeze, but to actively destroy the moon, to pull it from orbit, crash it into Tau Volantis, and end the signal it had been broadcasting for 2 million years. He was preparing to do exactly that when Scenario 5 arrived. The decision to invoke Scenario 5 was made by the Sovereign Colonies Council after receiving Serrano's own reports about what was on Tau Volantis and what the expedition had found. His descriptions of the alien civilization, the machine, the markers, the moon in orbit, and the nature of what Convergence actually produced were the information that convinced the Council that the only rational response was annihilation. Every researcher involved with the expedition, every ship in the fleet, every piece of data gathered across 3 years of work, every person on every related project across multiple star systems, General Spencer Mahad received the order and executed it with a precision that left nothing ambiguous about his willingness to carry it out. Scientists were killed, ships were disabled, the codex that Serrano had prepared, the key he needed to reconfigure the machine, was wiped of its data by Mahad before a private courier could reach the doctor with it. Mahad then ended his own life, saluting the flag of the sovereign colonies before he went. The expedition died without completing what Serrano had been hours away from finishing. The moon remained in orbit, the planet remained frozen. The mines placed in the debris field above Tau Volantis prevented any future ship from approaching without being destroyed. For 200 years, the secret stayed buried. A researcher named Demara Carver, working 2 centuries after the expedition's destruction, pieced together enough fragmented data from old SCAF records to rediscover what had been deliberately hidden. Her work identified Tau Volantis as a location the SCAF had considered significant enough to classify and erase. She was killed before she could act on what she'd found, her research seized by the Church of Unitology, who had their own reasons for wanting to know where the source of the marker signal was located. Her husband, John Carver, and a pilot named Ellie Langford would eventually use what remained of her work to mount the expedition that brought Isaac Clarke to Tau Volantis in 2513, 200 years after Mahad killed Serrano's courier. 2 million years and change since the Tau Volantis aliens built the machine around their own bodies and froze their world. What Isaac found when he got there was everything Serrano had documented, plus 200 years of deterioration, and the accumulated evidence of what it looks like when a civilization chooses extinction to prevent something worse. The alien city was still there. The statues that weren't statues were still in place. Rosetta's pieces, hidden by Serrano's team before the purge, waited to be reassembled. And above the frozen planet, the moon waited too, broadcasting through every active marker in the galaxy, sending the same 2 messages it had been sending for 2 million years. Turn it off, make us whole. 2 requests that sounded like they were asking for the same thing, aimed at whoever was willing to listen, waiting for the species the system had cultivated specifically to hear them. Chapter 6. Inside the Eye. Before examining what Isaac found on Tau Volantis, it is worth spending time with the mechanics of convergence itself, because understanding the process at the physical level changes how almost every major scene in the franchise reads. The convergence event doesn't begin at the moment the vortex appears. By the time the visible spectacle starts, by the time the necromorphs begin gathering in the characteristic pattern that marks the process's final stage, the convergence has already been building for as long as the outbreak has been running. Every body converted by the necromorph infection is a step. Every death that produces a new necromorph is an increment of accumulated biomass that brings the marker's critical threshold closer. The infection is not the catastrophe. The infection is the preparation. The threshold varies based on the marker's power and the available organic material. A large red marker in a densely populated area can reach convergence conditions relatively quickly. A smaller marker, or one operating in a low population environment, takes longer. The hive mind or nexus form what the lore describes as larger necromorph organisms that serve as relay nodes for the marker's signal and coordinating intelligence for the smaller necromorph forms. Appears to be something like the local neural center of the process, broadcasting the marker's signal outward to every converted body within range, and coordinating the infection's behavior in a way that individual necromorphs couldn't manage alone. These organisms are not the authority, they are the medium. The actual intelligence coordinating the entire process belongs to the moon. Everything below it, the markers, the nexus forms, the individual necromorphs, the human minds receiving the signal, the religions that form around the signal's emotional resonance, all of it is infrastructure. An antenna network distributed across the surface of a planet, broadcasting from a sleeping predator in orbit, designed to gather food for when the predator wakes up. When the convergence conditions are met, the gathering begins. The necromorphs circle the marker in a distinctive pattern, moving into the quiet zone around the artifact that the lore refers to as the dead space. This is the calm at the eye of what is about to become a storm. The marker's signal during active convergence creates a temporary suppression of the necromorph aggression toward everything within that radius, drawing them toward the artifact with the same intensity their aggression is usually directed outward. What looks like a gap in the threat, a moment of stillness where nothing is attacking, is actually the convergence's final preparation. Then the vortex begins. Massive bursts of energy are released by the marker. Wind creates a spiral around the artifact that quickly becomes powerful enough to lift the bodies of the gathered necromorphs off whatever surface they're standing on. The bodies rise. They move upward above the marker's position in a column of accumulated necrotic mass. The bodies begin to merge, fusing at points of contact, their individual structural components being repurposed into something that isn't any one of them anymore. Rock and debris from the surrounding environment are caught by the gravitational effects of the process, pulled into the structure forming above. The marker's signal, which has been broadcasting outward since the artifact was first activated, begins broadcasting upward into the growing mass, coordinating the biological construction taking place in the atmosphere above. What emerges from this process is not a collection of bodies. It is something that has never existed before as an individual entity, assembled from the raw material of a world that has been prepared specifically for this construction. The Brethren Moon, in its earliest stage of formation, is not yet the enormous thing the franchise eventually shows. At this point, it is a center, a core of organized necrotic matter oriented around the marker that seeded it, with the planet's own surface material and atmospheric debris being pulled into orbit to form the outer shell that will eventually give it the appearance of an actual celestial body. The moon is not metaphorically a moon. It becomes physically one, when the marker's own mass rises into the center of the structure, absorbed into the moon's heart. The new entity has everything it needs to join the wider network. Its own internal marker functions allow it to broadcast the same signal the original artifact broadcast to every remaining marker in the galaxy that is tuned to receive it. The new moon is online. The network expands by one. There is a useful comparison here to John Carpenter's film about a cellular organism that assimilates other life forms and replicates itself using the consumed species' own biology. The horror of that story comes from the impossibility of knowing whether any given individual has already been replaced by something wearing a borrowed face. The organism works by substitution, making itself indistinguishable from what it has consumed. The necromorphs operate differently. They don't substitute, they transform, visibly and irreversibly, into shapes that carry the logic of what they're doing on their surfaces. There is no horror of disguise in dead space. Everything the necromorphs are, you can see. The body is reshaped into something useful. The face is no longer recognizable. What was a person is now a machine component. The horror is not that you can't tell what's been replaced. The horror is that you can see exactly what the replacement is for. In that respect, the comparison that functions better than the cellular organism film is a different kind of distributed intelligence. The Gravemind from Halo occupies a structural position similar to a Brethren Moon, a networked intelligence that consumes all life forms and incorporates them into an expanding collective, operating across an entire galaxy and driven by a compulsion toward total consumption that the stories frame in quasi-religious terms. Both entities speak to the people who encounter them. Both communicate through the absorbed material of what they have consumed. Both are presented as something older than the civilizations that are currently facing them. The key distinction is in what the Gravemind claims to want. Within the Halo mythology, the Gravemind articulates a philosophy, argues for the value of what it creates, presents itself as something approaching a perspective to be engaged with. The Brethren Moons don't argue, they don't justify. The communications attributed to them across the Dead Space lore are instructions and statements of fact. They are coming, they are hungry, the time of ascension is at hand. There is no appeal to a shared value between the moons and the species they consume, because the moons don't experience those species as something to be persuaded. They experience them as what they are in the ecological structure of the universe. Food, understanding the moon's perspective, to whatever extent that word applies to the kind of consciousness the franchise attributes to them, requires sitting with a concept that is easy to name and genuinely difficult to inhabit. The Tau Volantis moon has been aware for 2 million years. It has had a functional mind capable of sending targeted signals through a galaxy-spanning network of markers, capable of communicating specific instructions to specific individuals, capable of recognizing when a marker maker was in proximity and adjusting its signal to target that person. This is not simple reflexive behavior. This is intelligence operating across timescales and distances that have no human equivalent. And for 2 million years, that intelligence has been trapped in a body that was frozen before it could fully form. Philosophy has spent considerable effort exploring the concept of consciousness without corresponding physical freedom. The thought experiment of a mind that can perceive everything happening around it but cannot act on any of it, that can experience every moment with full awareness but cannot move, cannot communicate through normal channels, cannot change anything about its situation through direct intervention, tends to produce a specific kind of horror in people who sit with it seriously. The prison the Tau Volantis moon has been in is not a cell, it is orbit. 2 million years of looking down at the planet that froze it, looking out at a galaxy that should have been reachable, with the full intelligence to understand exactly what happened and why. What that produces in the moon, what it drives it toward, we see through the signals it sends. The turn it off message, broadcast through every active marker that can receive the moon's frequency, is not a request in the sense that word implies the possibility of refusal. It is a statement of necessity. The moon needs the machine deactivated so the convergence can resume and the moon can complete its formation. Every compatible mind that receives that message through marker exposure is being used as an instrument toward that end. The moon doesn't care about the people it sends the signal through. It cares about the outcome. 2 million years of necessity has had plenty of time to become something that functions like desperation. When Isaac Clarke arrived on Tau Volantis, he arrived with the wrong understanding of what he was looking for. The expedition that brought him there, assembled from the fragments of Elsa Carver's research and the desperation of her husband and Ellie Langford, believed Tau Volantis was the marker homeworld, the original source, the planet where the markers were made and from which they had been sent outward across the galaxy. The goal was to find that source and shut it down, to find the root of the marker signal and sever it. What Isaac found instead was Serrano's logs, Rosetta's preserved remains scattered in pieces across the research complex, and the slowly assembling truth that Tau Volantis was not the origin of the markers themselves. It was one more chapter in a story that had no beginning visible to human investigation. The alien city beneath the frozen surface, the machine that incorporated the bodies of the civilization that built it, was not a monument to conquest. It was a monument to the specific kind of sacrifice that asks nothing of the future in return. The aliens who built it knew that what they were doing would end them. The planet would freeze. Their civilization, which Serrano speculated had extended across multiple star systems, would collapse. The moon would be stopped but not destroyed because they ran out of time before the second stage of the machine could be completed. What the bodies in the machine's walls said, beyond what any language could, was that the cost had been accepted. Reassembling Rosetta from the pieces Serrano's team had hidden before the Scenario 5 purge took effect gave Isaac and Carver what they needed to build a new codex. The alien specimen's unaltered DNA, preserved for 2 million years in the same cold that had frozen the planet, could interface with the machine's systems in a way that human genetic material could not. The technology the Tau Volantis aliens had built was encoded to their biology. Only their biology could operate it. This detail is worth pausing on, because it contains something the franchise leaves almost entirely implicit. The machine was built to be operated by the species that built it. Its second stage, the destruction of the moon, was designed to be completed by the Tau Volantis aliens themselves. They ran out of time before they could do it. 2 million years later, another species stood in the machine's heart, with a codex built from a dead civilization's last preserved specimen. The only reason Isaac could operate the machine at all was because the aliens had thought to leave the instructions behind, because they had built into their final catastrophic act the foresight to encode their own language in a way that a future species might be able to learn. They died knowing they had failed to finish the job. They also died knowing they had left the job findable if whoever came next was willing to look. Danik reached the machine before Isaac and Carver could stop him. The Unitologist leader, working from his sincere belief that convergence was the salvation his church had always promised, used the codex to turn the machine off. The moon, frozen for 2 million years, felt its restraints release. The convergence resumed. What followed is described in the game's final sequence in terms of the moon becoming fully active, pulling at the machine with its tentacles, fighting with everything it had to prevent what Isaac and Carver were trying to do. The battle was not between humans and a mindless creature. It was between two opposing uses of the machine, the moon trying to prevent completion of the second stage that the aliens had built in, and Isaac trying to complete what Sereno had been hours from finishing 2 centuries earlier. Isaac completed it. The machine crushed the moon into Tau Volantis. The signal the moon had been broadcasting through every marker in the galaxy went silent. Every active marker stopped. For the first time in recorded history, the signal that had been shaping civilizations across centuries of human space exploration simply ceased. For a moment, it looked like a victory. But here is the part of the ending that almost every conversation about Dead Space 3 moves through too quickly. The part that recontextualizes everything the trilogy had built toward and leaves the entire mythology in a state that the word victory doesn't accurately describe. The moon's death was not invisible to the wider network. Somewhere in the process of reawakening from its 2-million-year hibernation, and in the final moments before the machine completed its task, the Tau Volantis moon reached across the Brethren Moon network and communicated its situation to its kin. The other moons, dormant or traveling or feeding on other worlds, received the signal. They understood what was happening at Tau Volantis, and they understood what the destruction of one moon's signal meant for the galaxy it had been covering. The other moons turned toward the last detectable source of biological life in the region the Tau Volantis moon had been responsible for. They began moving toward it. They were heading for Earth, what Isaac and Carver found when they survived the crash, when Ellie's shuttle pulled them from the wreckage in the game's Awakened DLC, was not the aftermath of a completed victory. It was the first evidence that the victory had consequences they hadn't anticipated. Destroying the Tau Volantis moon had removed the signal that was keeping the wider network at bay. Every other Brethren moon in the network had just received confirmation that the last inhabited system in the galaxy's remaining dead space had living material worth consuming. All of them were coming now. This is the moment where the franchise's mythology becomes fully explicit about what the Convergence Event actually is at the largest scale. The Tau Volantis moon, frozen for 2 million years, was not the source of the marker threat to humanity. It was a single node in a network that spans the galaxy. Destroying it removed one signal from the system. The system itself, the Brethren moons in their entirety, was still intact, still operational, and now oriented toward the only remaining life they could detect. The title Dead Space describes what happens when they finish. Chapter 7. Every World Before Ours. Dr. Earl Serrano wrote his final audio log on Tau Volantis alone. With a broken leg, in the alien city he had spent years trying to understand. He had sent Corporal Kaufman to retrieve the codex that would let him complete the machine. He was waiting, and while he waited, he continued the work of documentation, recording what he had figured out for whoever might eventually find the record he was leaving behind. The log, discovered 2 centuries later by Isaac Clarke's team, contains something that functions as the closest thing the franchise ever comes to a thesis statement spoken aloud by a character who has actually earned the right to say it. Serrano paraphrases a colleague, a researcher who had once observed that no alien life had ever been confirmed to exist in the known universe, and notes that the colleague had been correct in a way neither of them understood at the time. There was no life beyond humanity's system. There was only a trail of extinction, stretching from wherever the moons had originated to the edge of human-explored space, wrought by the moons across a span of time that predated any civilization humanity had ever been able to imagine. And now, Serrano notes, the extinction was right on humanity's doorstep. This moment in the lore is the franchise's title drop. The phrase "dead space" appears throughout the games as part of the marker lore, describing the calm zone around an active marker where necromorphs gather before convergence, but it means something larger than that once Serrano's conclusion is understood. The universe is in a state of dead space. Every civilization advanced enough to detect, every world sophisticated enough to produce the kind of intelligence that could eventually encounter a marker, has already been consumed. What remains between humanity's corner of the galaxy and the origin point of the moons, wherever that is not populated darkness. It is the aftermath of feeding. What makes this idea so specifically devastating is what it answers. For decades, in real scientific discussion, the Fermi paradox has generated proposed solutions that range from reassuring to mildly troubling. Perhaps intelligent life is rare. Perhaps civilizations tend to self-destruct before reaching interstellar capability. Perhaps the distances involved make contact practically impossible, even between civilizations that both exist and are trying to communicate. Each of these answers, uncomfortable as some of them are, leaves open the possibility that somewhere out there, something is trying to reach us and simply hasn't managed it yet. Dead space closes that possibility entirely. The universe is not silent because life is rare, and the silence is not a communications problem. It is evidence of consumption. The species that might have answered, given enough time, were located and harvested before they could send anything detectable by anyone still alive to listen. This represents what physicists and cosmologists sometimes discuss under the category of great filter theories. The idea that some catastrophic barrier tends to eliminate civilizations before they can develop to true interstellar status. The debate in scientific circles centers on whether humanity has already passed that filter or whether it lies ahead of us. Dead Space offers its own version. The filter doesn't eliminate civilizations through any internal mechanism. It arrives from outside, in the form of something that has been waiting for civilizations to reach exactly the level of development where they make the best possible harvest. There is a darker parallel to this in what physicists and science fiction writers have discussed under the name of the dark forest theory, a concept describing a universe where advanced civilizations stay hidden because detection by other civilizations means potential predation. In that framework, the universe's silence reflects the strategy of every surviving intelligence: go dark, go small, go undetected. Because anything that can hear you can also come for you. The Brethren moons invert this completely. The moons don't require civilizations to be detectable. They plant the detection mechanism themselves. The black marker in the Chicxulub crater was not waiting for humanity to become detectable. It was the device that would make humanity become exactly what the moons needed, operating from inside the evolutionary and civilizational process rather than from outside it. There is no hiding from a predator that has already embedded itself in your planet's crust 65 million years before your species existed. The dark forest theory describes a universe where predators look for prey. Dead Space describes a universe where the predator already found you before you had a name for what you were, and has been patiently growing you toward the right size ever since. Serrano's logs suggest he attempted to quantify the scope of what the moons had done, working from the evidence available on Tau Volantis and the broader pattern he had identified in the marker signal's reach across the galaxy. His conclusion was that all life between the point of origin of the Brethren Moon network and humanity's home system had been extinguished. Every civilization, every species, everything that had ever developed the capacity to encounter a marker, the genetic material of all of it, mixed and compressed into the moon's uniform biomass, preserving in some biological sense the traces of what had been absorbed while functioning entirely in service of the moon's needs. Think about what that means for the scale of what the moons represent. The galaxy contains billions of stars. the fraction of those stars hosting worlds capable of producing life, however small or large it is, represents an enormous number of potential civilizations across 4 billion years of the galaxy's habitable period. Every one of those civilizations that reached the threshold where a black marker became relevant to them went through the same sequence: discovery, compulsion, replication, infection, convergence, a new moon added to the network. The moons are not ancient in the way that stars are ancient. They are ancient in the way that a dynasty is ancient, each generation building on what the previous generation consumed, the network growing with every new world absorbed, the collective biomass of every species that ever looked up at the stars and wondered about contact, now forming the structural material of the things that prevented that contact from ever happening. Where the moons came from originally, what produced the first moon before there was a network to build on, is something the franchise deliberately leaves unanswered. The lore acknowledges this gap explicitly. The true origin of the Brethren moons is unknown. The cycle as it currently operates is self-sustaining. Moons produce black markers. Black markers seed civilizations. Civilizations create red markers. Red markers trigger convergences. Convergences produce new moons. Whether something external created the first moon to start this cycle, or whether the first moon emerged from some process that the cycle itself eventually eliminated all evidence of, the franchise leaves open. This is not a plot hole. It is a deliberate gesture toward Lovecraftian cosmicism. Lovecraft, writing in the early 20th century, articulated a philosophical position about humanity's place in the universe that he called cosmicism. The central idea was that the universe has no particular awareness of or interest in human existence, that the entities which inhabit its larger scales have no more relationship to human significance than the deep ocean has to a single wave. His horror fiction populated the universe with vast, ancient intelligences, for which human beings were not enemies or prey or allies, but simply below the threshold of relevance. The most disturbing thing about Lovecraft's cosmic entities was not that they threatened humanity, it was that they barely noticed humanity at all. Dead Space inherits this framework and makes one significant modification. The Brethren moons are Lovecraftian in scale and age, and the relationship they have to human understanding. They are incomprehensible in the sense that their decisions, their timescales, and their relationship to the universe operate at levels human consciousness cannot fully process. But they are not indifferent to humanity. The moons are paying very close attention. They have been paying attention since they seeded Earth 65 million years ago. The horror in Dead Space is not that the universe doesn't care about human beings. It is that the universe's attention, when it finally arrives in full, will be expressed as consumption. Indifference would have been preferable. Understanding the moons at this scale requires one more frame of reference, and it comes from real biology rather than physics or philosophy. Biologists who study large-scale ecological systems have identified a category of organism they describe as ecosystem engineers, species whose presence so thoroughly alters the environment around them that entire ecological communities are reshaped by what they do. Beavers are often used as the example. A single beaver colony transforms waterways, creates wetlands, changes water tables, affects the population dynamics of dozens of species in the surrounding area, all as an incidental byproduct of the beaver pursuing its own needs. The beaver is not trying to reshape the ecosystem. It is building dams for its own reasons, and the ecosystem reshaping is a consequence. The Brethren moons are ecosystem engineers at galactic scale. The galaxy as it currently exists, with its apparent silence, its evidence of extensive organic material on worlds that no longer harbor visible civilization, its pattern of marker artifacts distributed across multiple star systems, is the ecosystem the moons have built as an incidental consequence of feeding. They are not maintaining the galaxy in its current state because they have a philosophy about silence or emptiness. The emptiness is just what happens when they pass through. What this means for humanity's position in the galaxy is something Serrano grasped in his final hours, and something that the franchise's ending makes unavoidable. The destruction of the Tau Volantis moon removed one signal from the network. The other moons, now oriented toward the last detectable source of biological life in the region, were not redirected because a single moon was destroyed. They were informed. The Tau Volantis moon's final communication to its kin, before it was crushed into the planet, told the rest of the network where to look. Isaac Clarke's victory at Tau Volantis was the moment the rest of the moons learned Earth existed. This is perhaps the most specific and disturbing instance of the misunderstanding the franchise's title asks about, because what Isaac believed he was doing at Tau Volantis was stopping the convergence. And he did stop the Tau Volantis convergence. He destroyed the moon that had been threatening humanity specifically because of its location and its signal. He completed what Serrano had been hours from completing, and what the Tau Volantis aliens had sacrificed their entire civilization to partially accomplish. And in doing so, he told the rest of the moons exactly where to go. Chapter 8. The Misunderstanding. Picture the moment in Dead Space 1 where Isaac Clarke returns the red marker to its place on Aegis 7. He has been fighting through the Ishimura for hours at this point. The corridors he has navigated have shown him enough horror that the psychological baseline of what registers as terrifying has shifted significantly upward from where it started. He is exhausted and damaged, and working from incomplete information, guided by a hallucination he believes is his partner, toward an action he has been told will stabilize the outbreak. He places the marker. He does what the game has asked him to do. Everything that follows from that action, the hive mind surfacing, the convergence conditions being met for the first time. The near catastrophe that Isaac only survives because the outbreak was too limited in scale to complete the process is a direct consequence of Isaac Clarke doing exactly what a reasonable person would do with the information he had available. He followed instructions. He completed the task. He acted with urgency and competence in a crisis situation, and he nearly ended everything. This is the central image of the franchise's entire mythology. And understanding why requires understanding the specific shape of the misunderstanding the script's title asks about. The misunderstanding is not about ignorance. Most of the characters in Dead Space who failed to stop the convergence were not stupid or negligent. The researchers on Aegis 7 who fell under the red marker's influence were scientists, competent and trained in the methods of careful investigation. The SCAF researchers on Tau Volantis included some of the most capable scientists in their civilization, led by a man, Serrano, who was eventually smart enough to understand exactly what was happening. The EarthGov project that built the Site-12 marker from Isaac's memories included the people that institution considered its best marker researchers. All of them failed to stop what the marker was doing. All of them, at crucial moments, became instruments of the process they were trying to understand, contain, or control. The misunderstanding isn't about intelligence, it's about frame. Every civilization that encountered the markers interpreted the encounter as a threat arriving from outside, something directed at them specifically, a weapon or a disaster requiring a defensive response. This frame is intuitive and almost entirely wrong. The Convergence Event is not something that arrives at a civilization. It is something that a civilization arrives at, following a path the markers laid out long before the civilization existed to walk it. Consider what this means for every response anyone ever made to the marker threat. Governments classified the black marker's existence and tried to contain its influence. The marker had already spent centuries shaping human civilization through Unitology by the time any government was sophisticated enough to recognize a threat to classify. EarthGov forced Isaac to build a new marker by extracting the blueprint from his mind in an attempt to understand and control the technology. The marker needed exactly that to happen, because building red markers is what civilizations are for in the convergence system. The SCAF invoked Scenario 5 and purged everything and everyone connected to the Tau Volantis expedition. The moon had already sent its signal through every active marker before Mahad could destroy the codex, and the information it needed to communicate had been communicated. Every defensive move, in retrospect, was already inside the marker's operating logic. The marker didn't need civilizations to succeed in containing it. It needed them to try. and in trying to take the specific actions that kept the markers protected, distributed, and operational long enough for the infection to spread. Psychological research on influence and decision-making has identified something uncomfortable about how human choices actually form under conditions of systematic external shaping. When an environment is designed to produce specific behaviors, when the choices available to individuals within that environment are not random, but selected to funnel decision-making toward particular outcomes, people within that environment typically experience their choices as free and self-determined. The constraints on their decision-making are not experienced as constraints because they are built into the environment rather than imposed as visible restrictions. The marker's relationship to the civilizations it encounters operates at this structural level. It doesn't command, it doesn't threaten. It shapes the information environment, the emotional landscape, and the cognitive tools that people within its influence use to make decisions. The religion it generates through Unitology shapes who people marry, how they vote, what they believe about death and meaning, and the purpose of existence. The dementia it produces in incompatible minds creates the chaos that keeps marker research active in desperate attempts at understanding. The compatible minds it cultivates produce the engineers and scientists and architects of whatever comes next. Within this environment, free choice describes something real but severely bounded. Isaac Clarke chose to return the marker to its pedestal. The choice was genuine. It was also the output of a decision-making process that had been systematically shaped by everything the marker had done to get Isaac to that point, starting with the signal that reached his mind on Aegis 7, and ending with the Nicole hallucination that guided him through the Ishimura to the marker. The marker didn't make the choice for him. It built the environment inside his own psychology, in which that choice was the one that made sense. This is the specific horror the franchise is working toward through 3 games, and it's one that most action-oriented readings of the series tend to pass over. Dead Space is not primarily a story about a man fighting monsters. It is a story about a man who cannot determine at any point in the series whether his actions are his own, or the expression of a process he has been part of since before he was born. The answer the lore suggests is that this question doesn't have a clean resolution. Both are true simultaneously. What the franchise does with this argument, at the level of gameplay design, is something worth examining closely, because the developers embedded the thesis in the mechanics in ways that work even on players who never engage with the lore at this level. The strategic dismemberment system trains the player to analyze bodies as systems of components with functions. This is how the marker analyzes bodies too, assessing what configuration serves its current needs and restructuring accordingly. By the 3rd game, the player has spent 2 games developing exactly the kind of systematic biological assessment that the convergence process applies to organic material. The horror the game teaches you is also the logic the horror runs on. The absence of a traditional heads-up display removes the player's sense of separation from Isaac's experience. There is no frame within the frame, no visual margin between the player's perspective and Isaac's. This is not merely atmospheric. It is the same border dissolution the marker's signal works to achieve in compatible minds. The signal's goal is to reduce the distinction between the marker's purposes and the individual's purposes. The game's design goal is to reduce the distinction between the player's experience and Isaac's experience. Both work by removing the visible separation. The engineer protagonist is the marker's preferred type. The player character in most action horror games is a soldier, a survivor, an improvised warrior. Isaac Clarke is someone whose professional skill set is analyzing and repairing complex systems. This is the specific type of mind the marker's signal can interface with most productively. The game's difficulty isn't just about survival. It's about applying engineering thinking to biological problems. And the better you get at the game, the more naturally you think about bodies and systems in the terms the marker uses. 3 games of playing Dead Space, and you have practiced extensively the cognitive approaches that make someone a marker maker. The franchise doesn't announce this. It builds it into the texture of how the games work and leaves the recognition to whoever is paying close enough attention. There is a tradition in horror fiction, going back to the literary cosmicism that Dead Space's designers explicitly cited as an influence, in which the horror lies not in what threatens the protagonist, but in what the protagonist learns about the position humanity occupies in the actual structure of the universe. The great cosmic horror stories are not primarily about survival. They are about the acquisition of a knowledge that changes what survival means. A character who fully understood the situation they were in would not fight to preserve humanity's status quo, because the status quo was already a condition of being cultivated for consumption. What makes Dead Space's version of this genuinely distinct from its antecedents is the nature of the promise at its center. The markers don't offer humanity nothing. The make us whole message, the foundational promise that Unitology was built on, contains something real. Convergence does create a new entity from the material it consumes. The dead are incorporated into something that persists after them, in a biological sense, in the strict material sense where continuity is defined by the persistence of matter rather than the persistence of self. The Unitologists were not entirely wrong. What they contributed would not cease to exist. It would become part of something that would endure for as long as the moons could find food. The mistake was in what whole meant in the promise. Unitologists heard made whole as a description of their own completion, their own return to something they had lost. What the marker meant by the phrase was the completion of a brethren moon. The wholeness was the moons. The believers were the material. The promise was real. The understanding of who the promise was for was the misunderstanding. Horror works this way at its most effective, not by fabricating a threat, but by revealing that something that looked like safety was always oriented toward danger. The haunted house that looks like refuge. The therapist who turns out to serve the institution. The community that welcomes you while preparing you for something you haven't consented to. Dead Space runs this mechanism at civilizational scale across 3 games and 2 centuries of in-universe history, and the specific version it is running is perhaps the most thorough one in the genre. The marker did not infiltrate human civilization. It built human civilization to be exactly the kind of civilization that would eventually arrive at convergence. The government projects that tried to harness marker technology were doing what civilizations of a certain type do when they encounter what looks like an extraordinary energy source. The religion that formed around the marker was doing what communities of a certain type do when they encounter something that speaks to their deepest needs. The engineers who built new markers from extracted blueprints were doing what technically sophisticated people do when they are given a set of instructions they understand. Every natural response to the marker advanced the marker's process. Now consider what that means for Isaac Clarke specifically, and why the franchise spent 3 games on him rather than on any of the other people who encountered the markers before and after. Isaac is not a hero in the traditional sense that the word implies someone whose personal virtues determined the outcome of a conflict. He is the person the marker's system most needed, and simultaneously the person most positioned to see through it, because his specific compatibility with the marker's signal gave him both the clearest view of the blueprint and, eventually, enough distance from the emotional manipulation to recognize when it was happening. What he experienced at the Site-12 marker, in the confrontation with the Nicole construct at the marker itself, was not a victory over the marker. It was a refusal. The marker had presented him with the emotional architecture it had spent years building inside him, the image of what he most wanted to retrieve, and the promise that going to the marker would achieve it. His refusal to accept that frame was the only action across 3 games that the marker's process hadn't accounted for. Everything else he did, the survival, the destruction of the hive mind, the Tau Volantis expedition, all of it was behavior the system could work with, could route around, could use. The refusal was the one moment where Isaac operated outside the frame the marker had built for him, and even that refusal had consequences the system could use. The Site-12 marker's destruction was one step in a sequence. The Tau Volantis moon's attempted revival, which followed from everything the Site-12 events put in motion, was the signal that told the other moons exactly where to find the last inhabited system. There is a bleakness to this that the franchise earns through genuine structural argument rather than nihilistic posturing. The bleakness is not that Isaac failed. He succeeded at every specific task he attempted. The bleakness is that success at the level the story presented to him was always already nested inside a larger process where his success served something he couldn't see clearly enough to address. The misunderstanding the title asks about runs deeper than theology or strategy or scientific analysis. It runs to the question of what kind of story was actually being told. Every character in Dead Space, from Altman's colleagues who founded a religion on his death to Serrano, who correctly identified the threat and still couldn't stop it, understood the marker as an antagonist, something to be used or worshipped or contained or destroyed. Something that had its own purposes which were the opposite of human purposes. The marker was not opposite to human purposes. It was upstream of them. Building civilization was one of its purposes. Spreading across multiple worlds was one of its purposes. Producing the specific types of minds that could receive and replicate its signal was one of its purposes. Generating the grief and meaning-making and desire for connection that made the Make Us Whole promise effective was, in some sense, the marker's influence implies one of its purposes. The misunderstanding was assuming that any of this was accidental. The misunderstanding was looking at 2 centuries of human civilization expanding across the solar system and seeing a story about humanity, when it was always a story about what humanity was being grown to be. The Brethren Moons, as the ending of Dead Space 3 makes clear, are not finished. Destroying the Tau Volantis moon ended one node of the network. The network itself is intact. The other moons, now alerted to the location of the last inhabited system they haven't yet consumed, are on their way. What awaits humanity at the end of the franchise's current arc is not a world that has been warned and can prepare. It is a world that has just been found by everything it was always meant to feed. The Awakened DLC depicts Isaac and Carver on their way back to Earth, knowing what is coming and understanding that nothing they can tell anyone will be sufficient preparation. The moon they fought was one. The network has more. The scale of what follows from the Tau Volantis victory is not something 2 people with personal weapons and the experience of 3 games worth of outbreaks can address. This is the point in the mythology where the genre framework the franchise has been working within breaks down in the most productive possible way. Survival horror assumes a survivable horror. The player's goal is to outlast the immediate threat, to find the exit, to get to the shuttle and escape the ship that's falling apart around them. Dead Space plays with this framework across 3 games, placing exits at the end of every narrative arc, giving Isaac the escape vessel and the moment of survival that structures the genre, and then placing, beyond every escape, a larger situation that the escape hasn't resolved. The shuttle that carries Isaac away from Titan Station doesn't carry him away from the marker's reach, because the marker's reach isn't the station. The ship that takes him away from Tau Volantis doesn't carry him away from the Brethren Moon network, because the network spans the galaxy. Every exit the games have built has been an exit from the current outbreak, not from the larger process that generates outbreaks. Understanding this doesn't make the exits meaningless. Survival is still survival. The people Isaac managed to get out of the Ishimera and the Sprawl and Tau Volantis are still alive because of what he did. The value of those individual outcomes is real. But in the context of the mythology the franchise has built, survival from individual outbreaks was always the scale the marker could afford to lose at. The Convergence doesn't need every attempt to succeed. It needs the overall process to continue. And the overall process has been continuing across civilizations and millennia and the accumulated biomass of every species the moons have ever fed on, right up until the moment the other moons learned where to go next. Chapter 9: Dead Space. The phrase Dead Space appears quietly in the lore of this franchise long before Dr. Francesca Serrano uses it in the way that gives the title its full meaning. It describes the calm zone around an active marker, the quiet eye inside the Convergence storm, where the necromorphs gather before the vortex begins, where the process organizes itself in a moment of stillness before the final violence. The dead space is the preparation. It is the holding pattern of something about to become catastrophic. Standing in it, not knowing what it is, you might mistake it for safety. This is the franchise's title, working at 3 different levels simultaneously, and understanding all 3 changes what 3 games of survival horror were actually about. The dead space around the marker describes the moment before convergence completes. The dead space of the galaxy describes what Serrano discovered about the state of everything between Earth and wherever the moons originated. And the dead space of the franchise itself, the particular kind of stillness that settles over a player who has followed Isaac Clarke from the Ishimura to Titan Station to Tau Volantis and back, describes a specific emotional condition that very few horror franchises are capable of producing. It is the stillness of understanding that the threat was never what you thought, was never located where you were looking, and cannot be addressed through any of the tools the story gave you. There is a distinction in how fear operates that psychology has spent considerable time trying to articulate cleanly. The difference between fear that is specific and fear that is structural. Specific fear responds to an identified threat. Something is behind the door, and when the door is opened, the situation resolves. Structural fear doesn't resolve with the door. It is the recognition that the door itself is part of an architecture that was built to produce exactly the experience of standing in front of it, not knowing what comes next. Structural fear is not about what's behind the door. It is about the building the door belongs to. Horror fiction tends to work best in specific fear, because specific fear is easiest to pace and stage and resolve at the moment the narrative requires a resolution. The monster appears. The monster is defeated. The audience is frightened and then relieved. This rhythm is satisfying in a way that structural fear can't always be, because structural fear doesn't offer the same kind of resolution. The architecture is still there after the monster falls. Dead Space builds specific fear very well. The Ishimura's necromorphs are staged with genuine craft. The pursuit sequences maintain tension. The dismemberment system creates encounters that require active cognitive engagement and produce genuine dread when it fails. As a piece of crafted specific horror, the franchise earned its place in the genre's conversation about how to generate sustained fear rather than momentary shock, but the mythology the franchise is actually carrying underneath all of that specific horror is structural. The markers are not monsters. The moons are not monsters in the conventional sense. The convergence process is not an attack. All of these descriptions fit the surface presentation well enough that they serve most players adequately through 3 games. The monster is the slasher. You cut off its arms, you move on. The structural horror underneath is that the slasher used to be a person whose death was anticipated by a process that started 65 million years before they were born, and their body is now an increment toward the construction of a predator the scale of a planet. When you understand both simultaneously, the specific and the structural, the fear produced is genuinely unusual. It is the horror of looking at something small and manageable and seeing at the same time the enormous and unmanageable thing it is a part of. Dead Space is, in this respect, operating in the same territory as the most effective cosmic horror literature, which produces its most disturbing moments not through confrontation with something obviously threatening, but through the revelation that something ordinary was always an expression of something incomprehensible. A character in a Lovecraftian story doesn't typically face a monster first and understand its cosmic context second. They begin to understand the context, and the understanding transforms the ordinary landscape they've been moving through into something fundamentally different from what they thought it was. Dead Space runs this process across 3 games with the specific advantage that games give over fiction. The player has been moving through the franchise's ordinary landscape for the entire runtime, making decisions and solving problems, and every decision made and every problem solved has been made and solved in ways that express the marker's operational logic. You were never just playing a game about surviving a space station. The complicity argument is worth sitting with, because it is the specific advantage games have over every other horror medium, and Dead Space uses it with more sophistication than almost any franchise in the genre. When you read a Lovecraftian story, you observe a protagonist encountering something that exceeds human comprehension. The experience is one of witness. When you watch a horror film, the camera mediates the experience through someone else's perspective, someone whose reactions frame what you're supposed to feel. In both cases, the audience maintains a position of separation from the events on screen or page. The horror happens to someone. You observe it happening. Games eliminate that separation. The strategic dismemberment mechanic doesn't ask you to watch Isaac analyze the structure of a necromorph's body. It requires you to perform that analysis yourself, in real time, under pressure. The knowledge of how bodies work and where they break that you develop across hours of play is knowledge you developed, not knowledge you observed a character developing. Your hands have practiced the assessment of bodies as systems of components. This is not only a design choice made for tension, it is a design choice that, in the context of the franchise's mythology, makes the player personally complicit in the logic the Convergence runs on. You have been thinking about bodies the way the marker thinks about bodies, not because the game told you to, but because the game required it for survival. The absence of the heads-up display takes the same logic to the environmental level. You have spent dozens of hours inside Isaac's perspective without any visual buffer between your experience and his. When the marker's signal begins to reshape what Isaac sees, you see it too, and there is no graphical frame around the vision, no border between the real game world and the hallucination. The same interface that showed you necromorphs shows you Nicole. The same visual system that depicted the Ishimura's corridors depicts the marker's constructed emotional landscape. By the end of 3 games, a player who paid attention to what they were doing has spent hundreds of hours practicing marker-compatible thinking without knowing that was what they were practicing. The games taught you survival skills that are structurally identical to the skills the marker cultivates in maker-compatible minds. This is the deepest level at which the franchise's mythology is expressed through its design. The misunderstanding the title asks about is not just something the characters experience, it is something the player experiences, in real time, in the act of playing. You spend 3 games trying to stop the Convergence, while the game's mechanics quietly shape you into someone who thinks the way the Convergence's instruments think. You played the marker's preferred type. Consider the phrase, "make us whole one more time," at the end of everything the franchise has revealed about its meaning. There are 3 different understandings of this phrase operating across the series, and each of them represents a different layer of the misunderstanding the franchise is exploring. The first understanding belongs to Unitologists. For Unitologists, "make us whole" described the union of grieving people with the loved one's death had separated them from. The us was the believers. The wholeness was reunion. The emotional architecture was built from the most universally human of experiences, the wound that loss creates, and the phrase offered to close that wound through a process the Church called transcendence. This understanding was sincere, widely held, deeply felt, and what made the Unitologist theology structurally durable across 2 centuries of institutional development. The grieving find whatever promises to address their grief, and they hold it. The second understanding belongs to the people who encountered the marker's signal more directly, who heard the phrase in their minds as a compulsion rather than a promise. For them, "make us whole" was an instruction, something to be acted on. The us, in this context, was vaguer, less emotionally resonant, more like a program running in the background than a conscious plea. Individuals under severe marker dementia drew the symbols, repeated the phrases, moved toward the marker with the purposefulness of people following directions they understood without knowing who gave them. This understanding was coercive rather than devotional, but it produced the same behavior: movement toward the marker, bodies in proximity to the artifact that needed them. The third understanding is the one the lore reveals across Dead Space 2 and 3, spoken in the transmissions and visions attributed to the Brethren Moon network. The us was the moons. The wholeness was the moon's completion. The phrase was a statement of need from a vast, conscious, ancient intelligence that had been frozen in a half-formed state for millions of years and was broadcasting its requirements to anyone in the galaxy capable of receiving the signal. "Make us whole," said the thing that was not whole. Every character who heard that phrase understood it according to their position in the franchise's architecture, and every understanding was a misunderstanding of who the us referred to, what kind of wholeness was being described, and whether the process that would achieve the wholeness was something to move toward or away from. The three-word phrase contains the entire hierarchy of the franchise's misunderstanding, nested from the personal to the civilizational to the cosmic, with each layer sincerely believing it understood what was being asked. Horror, as a genre, has always been understood as being primarily in the business of fear. The physiological response, the elevated heart rate and the adrenaline, and the specific unpleasantness of anticipation and sudden shock, is treated as the genre's product. Horror media is judged on how frightening it is, measured in some combination of immediate shock and sustained dread, and criticism of the genre often circles back to whether or not it succeeded at the visceral level. Dead Space succeeded at the visceral level, but what the franchise's mythology is actually doing sits at a significant remove from the visceral experience of fighting necromorphs in the dark. The philosopher Edmund Burke, writing in the 18th century, tried to describe a category of experience he called the sublime, something distinct from beauty and operating through a different mechanism. The sublime, in his account, was the experience of encountering something so vast, so powerful, or so structurally incomprehensible that ordinary human cognitive frameworks couldn't contain it. The response to the sublime was not comfort or pleasure, but a kind of overwhelmed awe, a confrontation with the limits of human comprehension that paradoxically produced something aesthetically intense rather than simply frightening. The mountains and oceans and storms that Burke used as examples produce something in the person experiencing them that fear alone doesn't capture. The sublime object is terrifying in one dimension, but it is also too large and too coherent and too indifferent to human scale for terror to be the primary response. Terror implies a threat you can run from, a danger with a specific shape and location. What the sublime produces is the recognition that the scale of what you're looking at exceeds the categories your mind uses to organize threat. Dead Space's Brethren Moons are, in this sense, a sublime horror rather than a conventional one. The franchise's most effective moments are not the jump scares or the dismemberment sequences, as well crafted as those are. They are the moments where the scale of what the marker mythology implies becomes legible, where a player sitting with the lore understands that what they are looking at is not a monster that can be fought, or a system that can be broken, but an architecture so deep and so long established that fighting individual convergence events is a bit like stopping individual waves while the ocean continues below. This produces something that is not quite fear, and not quite despair, and not quite awe, but partakes of all three simultaneously. Dead Space is, in the most technically accurate sense, a sublime horror franchise. The specific version of the sublime it works with has a real-world parallel that makes it resonate in a way that purely fictional cosmic horror sometimes doesn't quite achieve. There is a genuinely unsettling quality to realizing, as a person living in the actual world, that many of the systems that shape your life and choices were built before you were born by people whose priorities were not yours, for reasons that may have nothing to do with your well-being, and that your participation in those systems feels more or less voluntary from the inside, while being substantially structured from the outside. The labor conditions you work within, the cultural frameworks through which you understand love and grief and meaning, the information environments that determine what feels true and what feels false, what threats seem real and which ones seem distant. All of it was built before you arrived, and will continue after you're gone, and your individual choices, while genuinely yours, are nested inside contexts that shaped the options you were given. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural description of how complex civilizations work, and the specific discomfort it generates is not terror because no single monster is responsible for it. It is structural dread. Dead Space takes this structural dread and amplifies it to cosmic scale, externalizes it as a mythology, and then builds a franchise around a character trying to address it at the individual level. Isaac Clarke's heroism is absolutely real and absolutely insufficient to the scale of what the story frames as the actual problem. His victories matter to the people in the room. They do not change the building the room is in. The franchise was never cynical about this. It did not present Isaac's efforts as worthless. The people who survived the Ishimura, the people who escaped Titan Station, the temporary silencing of the marker signals after the Tau Volantis moon's destruction, these outcomes are portrayed with the emotional weight they deserve. Lives saved are lives saved. Moments of genuine human connection in the midst of horror are portrayed with genuine emotional care. What the franchise refused to do was pretend that defeating the immediate threat also addressed the architecture that produced it. And this refusal is what separates the Dead Space mythology from most of the horror entertainment landscape, where the monster, once killed, stays dead. There is something worth examining in why people choose to spend hours in the company of something this difficult. Not everyone who played Dead Space engaged with its mythology at the depth this script has been exploring. Many encountered it as a well-designed survival horror game and found the experience satisfying at exactly that level. But the franchise has sustained a community of deeply engaged players and analysts for over a decade. People who return to the lore long after the games have been completed, who trace the connections the series builds across its three main entries and its expanded fiction, who write and discuss and debate the implications of what the Brethren Moons represent. This level of engagement doesn't happen with horror that operates only at the specific level. You don't build a sustained interpretive community around something that is only about individual scares. The sustained engagement happens around something that touches the structural level, around a mythology that continues to generate implications after you put the controller down. Research on why people engage with frightening and disturbing media has found consistently that exposure to controlled horror serves a psychological function that varies by individual but tends to cluster around a few core operations. Some people use scary media to practice managing fear responses in a safe context. Some use it to explore situations their lives don't expose them to. Some use it to process anxieties they can't directly address in daily life by externalizing them into a contained narrative. But there is a fourth function that gets less attention in popular accounts of why horror works: horror as framework building. Some people seek out disturbing stories specifically because those stories provide a structure for thinking about things that don't have adequate frameworks in ordinary life. The specific terror of the unknown, the specific dread of systems that cannot be understood or controlled, the specific grief of loss that can't be undone. These experiences exist in everyone's life, and most cultural frameworks are better at offering consolation than they are at offering honest acknowledgement. Horror that honestly acknowledges the worst possible versions of these experiences, that builds the full architecture of what structural dread looks like, and lets the audience inhabit that architecture for a few hours, provides something consolation can't. Dead Space provides a framework for the specific experience of understanding that the thing causing you harm is too large to be defeated by the tools you have available, that your individual choices matter within the immediate context and are insufficient to the larger one, and that this combination of limited effectiveness and genuine responsibility is simply the condition you're in. This is not a comfortable framework. Comfort is not what it offers. What it offers instead is the particular relief of recognition, the feeling, however strange to articulate, that the worst reading of the situation has been named and examined and given a mythology worthy of its scale. The Brethren Moons consume civilizations because that is what the universe's apex predator does, and the universe's apex predator is real within this mythology, and you now have a name for it and an understanding of how it works. Knowing the name of the thing in the dark is not the same as stopping it, but it is meaningfully different from not knowing. The franchise left several questions unanswered when its main trilogy concluded, some of them by design, and some of them because the continuation that would have addressed them was never made. What happens when the moons reach Earth is not something the games resolved. Whether there was any viable response to a network of planet-sized predators converging on the last inhabited system, Any weapon or strategy or sacrifice on the scale of what the Tau Volantis aliens attempted is something the mythology built toward without delivering. This incompleteness is its own form of honesty. The Tau Volantis aliens built a machine and froze their planet and incorporated their bodies into the architecture of a device designed to stop the moon above them from completing the convergence. They did everything right in the sense that they correctly identified the threat and built the only response that had any genuine chance of working. They still didn't finish. The gap between what they attempted and what they achieved is where Isaac Clarke walked 2 million years later, trying to activate what they left unfinished. And completing what they started told the rest of the moons where to look. The franchise's mythology doesn't offer a clear exit from this. It offers the same thing Serrano's logs offer: a precise and honest description of a situation that exceeds the scale of any individual response. The aliens tried, Serrano tried, Mahad tried in his own way, choosing prevention of spread over completion of the solution, deciding that the machine remaining dormant was better than the signal reaching the rest of the moons in a moment of chaos. Isaac tried. None of them were wrong about the immediate goal they pursued. All of them were operating in a context larger than any of them could fully see while inside it. This is not a pessimistic mythology. It is a realistic one about the specific relationship between individual action and systemic scale, and it does not pretend that relationship resolves in favor of individuals just because the individuals are heroic enough. Dead space is the name of what the galaxy looks like when the moons have finished. It is also the name of the calm around the marker before the vortex begins. And it is the name of what you feel when you understand, sitting in a dark room at whatever hour you've listened to this far, that the franchise you've been thinking about was not primarily a story about survival. It was a story about what it feels like to be inside a system designed for an outcome you never agreed to, trying to protect what you can protect within the scope you actually have, while something incomprehensibly patient waits for the process to run its course. Every Unitologist who prayed for wholeness was inside that system, not knowing what kind. Every EarthGov researcher who built a marker from extracted memories was inside it. Every general who chose extinction over spread was inside it. Every version of Nicole that appeared to Isaac across the games was constructed by something inside it, calibrated to the emotional frequencies of a specific person who had spent his whole career trying to hold things together. Isaac Clarke was inside it from the moment the black marker arrived on Earth 65 million years before he was born. The franchise asks whether we misunderstood the Convergence Event. The honest answer the mythology delivers is that misunderstanding wasn't a failure of intelligence or investigation. It was the designed condition. The convergence was always meant to be misunderstood at the individual scale because accurate understanding at the civilizational scale only comes when enough time has passed to see the pattern. And by the time you can see the pattern clearly enough to describe it, you are already standing at Tau Volantis in the ruins of the last species that saw it too. The moons built something that was always going to look like something else from inside it. That is the answer to the title's question. And the reason the answer feels like it opens something rather than closes it is that knowing it doesn't change your position in the story. You are still here. The architecture is still here. The moons are still coming. And the dead space around the marker is very quiet,